and so I thought it would be nice, since it's summer and it's informal and we're all sweating in our various places, just to talk a little informally for a few minutes about the trip that I just got back from 2 days ago. That trip, as many of you know, I am seriously trying to cut down my travel work and have really successfully cut that down almost to zero. But these last 5 weeks, I made a number of exceptions. Part of that was because Elaine and I made this decision to do this together. Elaine spent 5 weeks up in Canada doing research for her Doctor of Ministry degree. And because she had to be there and away from home, I decided to group a number of speaking opportunities together. And so Elaine and I left on the same day and returned on the same day. It was a very, very long trip, much longer than either of us liked to do. While we were gone, Chris and Raquel kept the office going and kept our yard from completely drying up in this extended drought that we are in. But there are a number of things that on this trip that were opportunities to talk about some of the issues that we are really focusing on these days, not least being climate catastrophe and what that means in terms of our faith and our practice. And so the focus for most of these last 5 weeks was our work on watershed discipleship. I think many of you have seen the article that came out in the May Sojourners on watershed discipleship, and that really was the theme, but with a wide spectrum of different groups. This was part of an attempt to sort of test the waters and see how this message is resonating. So the trip began with 2 weeks in North Carolina. It began at Circle of Mercy. Circle of Mercy is a longtime sister community of ours. It's made up of Alliance of Baptist folk in Asheville, friends such as Joyce Holliday, Ken and Nancy Sehested, and others are at that church. It's kind of an alternative church that has been, I think, going for about 15 years or so. And unfortunately, my plane was late, and not unlike the present webinar, I got in to Asheville right at the time that the service was starting, so I ended up getting to church right in time to preach, and talked with them about Pentecost and discipleship, and had really good meetings with the elder members, the senior leadership of that vibrant congregation. So it was really wonderful to touch base with Circle of Mercy. It was my first time to actually visit that community that we've known of for many years. The next stop was also in Asheville at Warren Wilson College, and that was a opportunity created by Wake Forest Divinity School's Food and Faith Institute that was founded a couple of years ago by Fred Bonson. You might know Fred's work, Soil and Sacrament, a book I recommend to you. Fred has been a voice of food justice and community gardening and farming for many years, and he has started this Food and Faith Institute. So we had about 30, 35 folk gathered at Warren Wilson College. Warren Wilson College is a historically alternative college up in the mountains of Asheville, where every student gives 15 hours a week as part of their curriculum in work study to keep the college running, including keeping a farm and large gardens and animal husbandry going. It's a very green college, and so it was really fun to be on campus there and have this institute. The institute began with an ecumenical forum on climate change that was sponsored by a local ecumenical group. And there were about 150 people who gathered to hear a number of different speakers, in addition to myself, we heard from one of the lead authors of the federal climate report. This is a report that Congress commissioned in 1993 that scientists would report to the president every 4 years about what was happening with climate change. That has not happened. There have not been reports every 4 years. This is just the third report since 1993, but it just came out this year called Climate Change Impacts in the U.S. This guy was a local atmospheric scientist, one of the lead authors on this report, is there in Asheville. And it was very, very sobering to hear his assessments of where we are with climate change. Basically, he summarized the consensus in the scientific community. And that consensus is, A, that impacts of climate change are much more dramatic and happening much faster than any scientists have been predicting. So all of the sort of rather apocalyptic scenarios that scientists have been spinning for the last 15 years have actually underestimated the impact of climate catastrophe. The second conclusion of this report is that there is absolutely no doubt now that all of these changes are the result of human impact, or what is called anthropogenic climate change. So that was really, really sobering to hear that from one of the lead scientists. I talked with him quite a while after that, and it really confirmed in me that this is something that we have to talk about, as it impacts our faith and practice in every possible way. We began after that a 4-day extended seminar on watershed discipleship as a response to climate catastrophe, and it was just a really wonderful group. A couple of you were on this webinar tonight. There were a number of old friends who came, including Stuart Taylor, a Presbyterian minister there in North Carolina, who was the co-author of a book that we published almost 20 years ago called Say to This Mountain. And I hadn't seen Stuart in probably more than 15 years, and it was really good to see Stuart. He is really doing a lot of great watershed work in his parish. Met some folks from the United Kingdom who have been studying with folks who are doing some of the leading work on climate catastrophe, including Timothy Goringe, a theologian at Exeter, and also Michael Northcutt, whose book, A Political Theology of Climate Change, is one of the most important reads out, just came out last year, and I highly recommend it to you. One of the people who was part of this conference was Hillary Brownsmith. Hillary is a member of Circle of Mercy who came along to the Watershed Discipleship Week and then continued to accompany me after that over the weekend. And a young woman who has a strong background in working with LGBT justice and with homeless justice. And Hillary really is all hands on deck around the issues we were talking about, and we look forward to working with her more in the future. Our PowerPoint is almost up. I'm going to give it about 3 more minutes. In addition to us working on the theology and practices of watershed discipleship during this week, we had a number of site visits of really impressive permaculture installations to try to look at the yes that we can speak. This was particularly poignant because of the Permaculture Institute that we did in April and May here, that both Raquel and Chris were part of. And one of the sites was Earth Haven Eco Village, one of the largest and most impressive eco villages in the country, about 40 minutes outside of Asheville. There, Chuck Marsh, who's one of the senior trainers and permaculturists in the country, led us on a variety of site visits, including Earth Haven, where he lives, and where they have a botanical garden and a nursery of various kinds of permaculture-related plants. We also visited an edible forest garden public park that has been installed in a public park in Asheville, one of the first of its kind in the U.S., in which permaculture installations are right there in the public park, and people can harvest food. It was really impressive. We also saw a major home-level permaculture installation right in the city of Asheville. These were really inspiring demonstration projects to see what permaculture can do, whether it's on 300 acres like Earth Haven, or on half an acre, such as this home site, or on this public park. Toward the end of that week, we had a beautiful gathering on the deck of the old farmhouse at Warren Wilson. And there we made our own music and recited our own poetry and told our own jokes as a community, as a class. And in particular, a young woman by the name of Pip from the United Kingdom pulled out her ukulele and played a song that she has recorded with her band, Pip and the Polar Bears, which is a cutting-edge climate change band in England. And she played the song for us, and it immediately resonated with us as a kind of an anthem of the Watershed discipleship movement. And we even got her to do several takes and videotaped it, but unfortunately the videotape didn't work. But we're going to get an audio recording and post it on our website. So that was a week full of both theory and practice, demonstration, plots, and community building that pretty much everybody who was part of it, praying together, singing together, studying together, concurred that this was one of the most profound times that they had spent with a group. And I'm very, very grateful to Fred Bonson and to Wake Forest for making this space available. This is an annual institute, and I really encourage you to look for it next year in June up in Asheville. From there, I had a few days off and planned to go down to the Triangle area of North Carolina. And that is where I sort of paid homage to several elders. First stop was Z and Charlene Holler, elder couple in Greensboro who have long been part of the Beloved Community Center. Z was the only white minister in Greensboro who stood in solidarity with people who were attacked by the Klan back in 1979. 5 people were killed. Labor organizers were wounded. The movement was crushed by both police and white racist violence. And Z. Holler was the only white minister in town to stand with these folks, and ever since has been a great spirit. In the last 2 years, he's begun to develop dementia, and it was really hard to see this elder beginning to slip away. But it was so good to be with him and his amazing partner, Charlene, former school teacher, retired school teacher, who is every bit a supporter and a giant of solidarity in Greensboro. I also spent some time with the Beloved Community Center, which has long been a partner of ours for almost 20 years now. We think that the spirit and practice of the work of Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement is more incarnated in the Beloved Community Center than anywhere else in the country. And whenever we can, we check in with Joyce and Nelson Johnson, part of the ministerial team at Faith Community Church. So I was able to attend church at Faith Community on Sunday morning and had some very, very good meetings and think about ways to continue to collaborate with Nelson and Joyce in the afternoon. I also got to hear Brother Wesley, and I see our PowerPoint is finally up. So I'll just catch you up very quickly. These are some of the faces at Circle of Mercy in Asheville. Here's the awesome crowd at Warren Wilson College with the Watershed Discipleship Seminar. These are some of this is Fred Monson in the middle, and Stuart Taylor, who I talked about, the Presbyterian minister, on the lower left, Hillary Brown-Smith on the upper left. I did have the opportunity to touch in with Anthony Spearman. He's pictured talking with me in the upper right-hand corner. Anthony is a minister at the ME Zion Church in Hickory, North Carolina, who has really been a leader not only in the Moral Monday movement, about which more in a minute, but also in LGBT rights in North Carolina. He's taken some real hits for that. These are pictures of us, of the community at prayer and study, looking at the various watersheds of North Carolina. This is Earth Haven Eco Village, beautiful common space that they built, yeah, very, very impressive installation. About 80 people living there on those 300 acres. This is Chuck Marsh, the permaculturist, talking to us about plants, as he did no less than 4 times that week. This is the permaculture installation in the city of Asheville, and this is Pip and some local musicians playing her version of Stand Your Ground on the porch at the farmhouse at Warren Wilson College. Upper left is the Venerable Z. Haller, and below him are Nelson and Joyce Johnson, dear friends. Faith Community Church even has a community garden right there on that side of the other side of the tracks at Greensboro. And this is Wesley, who preached on Sunday and who's a great young organizer on the bottom right-hand corner. The following Monday, it was my intention to get to Raleigh, North Carolina, and experience Moral Monday. Moral Monday, in my opinion, is one of the most significant social movements in the U.S. today, if not the most significant. It has largely been animated by William Barber of the NAACP. He's the president in North Carolina. Barber has once again invited us to see that North Carolina is in many ways a bellwether state. It is both a place where some of the most significant social movements have come, such as the inauguration of the civil rights sit-in movement in 1960 on one hand, but it's also a place where some of the worst politics and legislation have happened historically and are happening today. So this is a sign from a Moral Monday demonstration. In a nutshell, the North Carolina legislature, which was taken over by the Tea Party in 2012, has in fact set the clock back 50 years, undoing health, welfare, education, and voting rights, rolling that back almost to pre-civil rights status. And so in response to just a relentless series of the most awful sorts of legislation, which is a bellwether of the kind of reactionary legislation that is happening throughout the U.S. Dr. Barber began what he calls HK on J marches in 2006, in which thousands of people came to the North Carolina capital of Raleigh and marched to protest this sort of omnibus bad legislation. So it's really amazing confrontation of good religion and bad politics. They talk about fusion politics in the Moral Monday movement, and I encourage you to look on YouTube. There's a William Barber channel on YouTube with all kinds of reports from Moral Monday. In particular, I urge you to look at his talk called The Third Reconstruction, in which he looks at the political context of both bad politics and powerful religious social movements. Fusion politics is an attempt to have a broad front of human rights and welfare rights and health and education. And the Moral Monday movement has really been a magnificent expression of fusion politics that is bringing people together across the spectrum. Their slogan is "Forward Together, not one step back," and it's really impressive. Of course, what they're up against, and this political cartoon kind of summarizes it. Moral Mondays, every Monday for 60 weeks, they've been protesting at the Capitol, but the rest of the week, the legislature is busy passing really, really regressive kinds of legislation, including taking money directly away from poor people and handing it over in the form of subsidies to the carbon industry, both fracking and oil drilling. So Moral Monday is very much a vanguard trying to both confront the legislature and awaken the country to the sort of regressive politics that are happening. This is a view of what happens each Monday at the Raleigh Capitol. It's a rotunda, and you can see 2 floors here where all the folks on the balcony are chanting and carrying on their typical chant. This is what democracy looks like, trying to take over the people's house and take it away from bad legislature, and they're answering, that is what hypocrisy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. That is what hypocrisy looks like. And the chanting gets so loud that the legislators actually can't do their work. And at that point, the choreography is the security comes out and threatens everybody with arrest and making too much noise, and at which point William Barber choreographs even louder chanting. It's really a pretty magnificent form of nonviolent direct action and people's democracy. People have been arrested every month for 60 months. School teachers, ministers, nurses, even Uncle Sam himself. More than 1,000 people have been arrested. I know this because I was the 1,001st person arrested on week 60 of the Moral Monday movement. This is a picture in the upper left of Nelson holding a workshop in the Capitol building. Just a really significant social movement which I invite you to pay attention to no matter where you are in the country. And I was very, very happy that I had the opportunity to see the Moral Monday action in person. It is in many ways reiterating, re-embodying the best of the civil rights movement. A lot of young people are involved, and something for all of us to be paying attention to, in my opinion. After that ordeal, including a short stint through half the night in the Raleigh jail, I was able the next day to move on to a really interesting group called Anthony's Plot, a group of Moravians who, as sort of part of the evangelical push toward social justice, are doing some really fine work with immigrants and with poor folks in the city of Winston-Salem in the Triangle area. And I also was able to meet some local ministers who are doing anti-racism work there, and we had a really good forum on immigrant rights and its relationship to the whole justice movement. That brought me back up the mountain after that to outside of Asheville Hot Springs, and that began a magnificent expression of radical discipleship known as the Carnival de Resistance. And this was part of the Wild Goose Festival, animated by the woman pictured here in the middle, Tevin East, who we've been working with for 8 or 9 years now. Just an amazing young artist and leader. And they debuted the Carnival de Resistance in Virginia last year, and this year had a full-fledged carnival as part of a parallel festival to the Wild Goose Gathering. There were, under a huge big top, there were more than 40 people animating this carnival. amazing costumes, performances, games, all having to do with the ecological crisis, both the theology of our response, the practices, and the politics. There were parades through the Wild Goose Festival. There even was an appearance by somebody they called the Squiship, otherwise known as me in a squid hat, as part of one of 4 evening performances that followed the elemental, the elements air, earth, fire, and water, with some amazing performances. Really, the Carnival de Resistance stole the show at the Wild Goose Festival. The tent was packed on a regular basis, and just some incredibly creative things happening. Our old friend Dmitry Kadyev, who's done a mural here at our place, was there doing a mural painting, a live mural painting that was then taken in the closing parade. And of course, Jim Perkinson, our great poet laureate of Word and World, and from whom you're going to hear later in this evening, was there not only reading his own poetry, but many of the performances by the carnavalistas are done to material that Jim has written for the carnival, and Jim may want to talk a little bit about that later when we get to him. So a very, very inspiring installation. It's art, it's music, it's performance, it's a lot of fun, a lot of creativity. It took a huge amount of work to erect this thing. In the upper right are Tevin and her partner Jay Beck, who is also very much part of the animating force behind the Carnaval de Resistance. And so I, again, urge you to keep your eyes out for the carnival. There were other good things about the Wild Goose Festival, including artist and friend Ted Litton-Hatton, who was the curator of the visual arts and who did some ephemeral art and also some installation art in the art tent. William Barber came and talked about the Moral Monday movement. That probably drew the biggest crowd at the festival, and rightly so. Got to meet Jin Kim of the People's Church in Minneapolis, and saw a lot of friends. Mike Boucher of Word and World, Chris Krataski, our permaculture teacher here at the Institute a few months ago. So it was a great gathering of the clan, this 4-day festival. Exhausted, I dragged myself on a plane and joined the hard-working Elaine Enns in Canada for 9 days, getting a glimpse of some of the amazing work that she is doing around her Doctor of Ministry. We had the opportunity to take do a couple of interviews together. One was with Ray Funk, a Mennonite. He's pictured on the left, in the upper left-hand corner. Ray Funk has been one of the Mennonites in Saskatchewan who has really been pressing for solidarity with Indigenous people in the prairies. And Ray has been very much involved in the Stony Knoll issue, which Elaine is working with Mennonite Central Committee on, an attempt to explore what reparation would mean to the young Chippewayan people whose land was taken away from them by the Canadian government and then in turn handed over to Mennonite settlers. We also had the opportunity to go with Joe on the right here, upper right-hand corner, into the Muscadet First Nation, where he is a member. And Joe has worked a lot with Heifer Project International in doing community gardens at the Muscadet First Nation. Joe worked closely with Elaine's brother Gordon and gave us just a really amazing tour of this First Nation and talked about the politics and economics of Indigenous survival and flourishing despite the intense racism in Canadian society. So aside from visiting lots of Elaine's family and accompanying Elaine on her very rigorous study program, we got to have some really interesting interviews with some of the folks that she's working with up there. And soon and very soon, Elaine will be telling her own story on one of these webinars. From there, I went back down to the States to Chicago to work with the Ecclesia Project, which has been running for about 15 years, a sort of a theological conversation that happens each summer, usually about 150 or 200 people. There, I got to spend time with another Canadian, Norman Wurzbach, also from the prairies, but Norman teaches at Duke Divinity School now. Wurzbach is one of the foremost interpreters of Wendell Berry's work and does a lot of co-editing work with Wendell Berry, and it was really great to catch up with him, also a good friend of Elaine's brother Gordon. One of the most interesting things that happened was meeting this young woman pictured here on the lower right, who is a climate change activist who was raised in a fundamentalist family, and her father is still the pastor of one of the largest megachurches in North Carolina. And Years of Living Dangerously, the Showtime series, which has been running this year on climate change, did a whole segment on her and the conversation she's been having, the running debate she's been having with her father. It's a fascinating insight into the way in which climate change and the culture wars play out. Some of the folks that I saw there include Reagan Sutterfield, who is author of Farming as a Spiritual Discipline on the upper left, Mark Laubranson, a Fuller professor and good friend, Kelly Johnson, who is the author of Fear of Beggars, a book that came out about 5 years ago on the mendicant tradition, Michael Iafredi, who's been very, very involved in Appalachian Catholic, who's busy writing the next People's Pastoral about poverty and justice and mountaintop removal in Appalachia. Joanna Schenk, our colleague from Elkhart and author of the book Widening the Circle. Kyle Childress, who's the guy in the white shirt there, was a really interesting new friend from Texas. He's a guy who opened his Baptist church in radical hospitality to all the tree sitters who were blockading the Keystone XL pipeline a few years ago. They were up in trees and doing all sorts of guerrilla actions, and Cal Childress's church was the only church in the area that welcomed them, and it was fascinating talking to him about the vocation of the church to be in solidarity with resistors. And finally, Rick Hudgens, who's been a longtime friend as part of Reba Place Fellowship in Chicago. From Chicago, I moved on to Louisville, Kentucky, where I preached at Jeff Street Baptist Church, which is pictured here, and was hosted by Andy Loving and Susan Taylor, who are the staff people at Just Money Advisors and close collaborators with us around Sabbath economics issues. If you know our DVD on Sabbath economics and social investing, Andy is featured on that. Really wonderful church, again a Baptist church that is committed to solidarity with poor folk in Louisville. They do coffee houses and daily opening up their space to homeless folk. So it was really inspiring to be with them. The final stop of this trip was the Haley Farm of Children's Defense Fund, and I want to just conclude by saying a few words about this. It was probably the most inspiring for me part of this journey. Pictured here is Marion Wright Edelman, who is the animator of this amazing space that is on the historic farm of Alex Haley, the author of Roots that many of you may have known. This farm has been going since the early 90s when Marion engineered a purchase of it. It features, it's the only place in the world that features two buildings designed by Maya Lin, the architect who designed the Vietnam Veterans War Memorial in DC. This is the chapel above and the library, both amazing buildings. The chapel is sort of inspired by the idea of Noah's Ark. Just a beautiful, about 200-acre space where for half the year, Children's Defense Fund runs freedom schools. And these schools are operating all around the country, beginning in elementary school and going all the way through middle school, high school, and into college. All different levels of freedom schools, in which graduates of freedom schools then become trainers as they get older for younger people. It really is based on the freedom school tradition of the civil rights movement. This was a particularly poignant year to be at Haley Farm because it was the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer in 1964 in Mississippi, which is a place where the original freedom school movement flourished. You see a picture of that in your upper right-hand corner. I just came away from this time utterly convinced of the genius of Marian Wright Edelman's vision for full spectrum freedom schools, and indeed for her political vision. Marian is someone who believes that the way to attack poverty in the United States is to do it through the plight of children. She understands that that is the least controversial political angle, and yet her angle of approach is very, very radical. They have up to 2,000 kids trained at freedom schools each year at one time, and all sorts of other trainings, including this Proctor Institute that I was a part of. I just really want, if you're not familiar with the work of Marian Wright Edelman, I want you to make yourselves familiar with it. She is someone who, in my opinion, gets things politically and is a magnificent organizer and visionary who is able to work with mainstream policy advocacy and yet grounds it all in the most radical sort of civil rights freedom school approach that is radical in its racial politics, its economic politics. So I really want to commend her work to you and the work of Children's Defense Fund. There's probably some presence of CDF somewhere in your state. The Proctor Institute is an expression of some of the adult leadership of the Freedom School movement. This is part of the team that came down from Nashville, Tennessee. Janet Wolfe, the white woman pictured there, has been a longtime friend. I've known Marian this webinar. As I was saying, I've known Marian Wright Edelman for about 15 years, but this is the first time I've really had a chance to spend intensive time with her. We had some great conversations. A lot of this was made possible by Janet Wolfe, who you see pictured here, the white woman who's working with this team in Nashville. That includes, to her right, Shakya Cherry Donaldson, Eric Brown, and the person I was probably most impressed with was a man by the name of Ndume Olatushani. And Ndume spent 28 years in prison, 20 years on death row for a crime he didn't commit. He was just recently exonerated, got out in 2012. He is now working with Children's Defense Fund doing art with both at-risk youth and other inside prisoners. Just amazing, amazing folks. And it was a real privilege to get to know some of these folks. Also got to know some of these folks clockwise from the top left. Rodney Sadler is a theologian activist in North Carolina, very involved in the Moral Monday movement, and an Old Testament professor at Union Seminary. So it was really great to meet him. Kojo Nantambu, to his right, a longtime activist and good friend of Joyce and Nelson Johnson, also very active in Moral Monday. Beneath, Rodney Sadler from Allentown, Pennsylvania, another activist preacher. But probably the two most sacred moments of the week for me was at the beginning of the week in an early morning prayer circle. We buried some of Gordon Cosby's ashes, the great elder who passed away a year and a half ago, who founded Church of the Savior in Washington, D.C. Some of his ashes were set aside to be buried here at Haley Farm. Gordon and Marion were very, very good friends, both living in D.C. In many ways, Gordon was Marion's confidant and spiritual advisor. I had the same relationship with Gordon, so for me it was hugely important to be able to be part of this interment of some of his ashes on the grounds. Another thing that happened was the opportunity to have long table conversations with folks such as Jim Lawson. Jim lives in Los Angeles, one of the veterans of the movement, probably the most significant nonviolence trainer and organizer during the civil rights movement. Jim Lawson was the person who invited, who really thought of the sit-in movement in 1960, and later who invited Dr. King to come to Memphis to stand with the sanitation workers. Jim has continued to be a champion of labor rights and human rights and economic rights, and a nonviolence trainer down in Los Angeles. But again, this provided lots of time for us to talk, and this was one of our conversations in which we were asking him stories of such, and asking him questions such as, where were you on the day that King was shot, and what did that mean for you, and so on. So there were some really, really special moments. Also some really great leaders in the movement, whether that's Romal Toon, sort of a hip-hop artist, and well known in some circles for this book, God's Graffiti. We had the great privilege of hearing both Otis Mosses preach together. Otis Moss Jr., who is the elder, and Otis Moss III, who is the younger, pictured on the bottom right. World-class preachers talking together about the art of preaching. That was pretty spectacular. Emily Towns, a womanist theologian from Vanderbilt, was there. And probably for me, the highlight was getting the chance to talk with Jim Cone and hear Jim Cone talk very personally about the origins of black theology and his journey as a theologian coming out of the 60s in writing black theology. Jim Cone's new book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, is, in my opinion, one of the most important books to be published theologically in the last generation, and I really commend it to you. So that was really great to see Jim, who's pictured in the middle at the top left. And of course, these Freedom Schools, this Proctor Institute, takes place every year in the summer, and I cannot commend it more highly for you all to think about it next year to attend the Proctor Institute. Always happens in July in Tennessee. It is a place where you can meet some of the greatest progressive black church leaders and really be inspired that Freedom Schools are something we can all participate in. So I anticipate that we will have even closer collaboration with Children's Defense Fund and the Freedom School movement from here on, and I really want to urge you to support it. All of this traveling, a very long and hard 5 weeks, but very inspiring, was made possible, of course, because Chris and Raquel, our intrepid staff, were keeping things going on here, and we are so, Elaine and I are so delighted to have a team on whose behalf we do this work. So thanks, next door in Mint Julep Land. Thanks, Chris and Raquel and Elaine, for making this trip possible. That finally brings us to our topic. So I've split the time here, but I really did think that it was worthwhile to share a little bit about life on the road and the amazing people out there who we collaborate with, because you all are people like that. Almost all of you who are on this webinar tonight were people that we met through this sort of travel, and just thought it was worth sharing this experience. It's all part of movement building. But on to Elijah. Elijah is clearly in the tradition of the Hebrew Bible one of the great prophets. He's pictured here in John Singer Sargent's famous frieze on Boston Public Library with Joshua and Moses. That would clearly be how the Hebraic tradition views this prophet. And so I thought it might be interesting to look a little bit at the life of Elijah and just take a few core samples out of the ministry of Elijah, particularly looking at him as a wilderness prophet. And I'm going to try to quickly summarize these 4 core samples from the Elijah cycle, which you find in 1 Kings 17 through 2 Kings 2. And then turn it over to Jim Perkinson to talk a little bit about his work on wilderness prophecy. You know, I've long been fascinated with Elijah, particularly since working on Mark's Gospel, because Elijah plays such a haunting role in Mark's Gospel. We know, for example, that Elijah doesn't die. He is taken up into the heavens on a chariot of fire in 2 Kings 2. And that meant for Hebrew faith that because his story lacked closure, Elijah might return at any point. That's the ancient meaning of an assumption. That's true for the assumption of Elijah. It's true for the assumption of Jesus. That there's this way that the prophets are taken up by way of affirmation of their work and witness. But there's always this sense that they may be back at any time. And so in that sense, Elijah haunted the history of Israel. So for example, the prophet Malachi and his oracles ends with this text: I will send you the prophet Elijah before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. And Elijah will turn people around, turn history around in order to avoid judgment. So this already in the late biblical period was a notion that at the 11th hour, Elijah would come back to turn the people around to avoid impending disaster. And that seems to be very, very relevant still to us as we live in an era of climate catastrophe with impending judgment coming upon us. We still look to the spirit of Elijah that haunts our world. So indeed, the Gospel of Mark opens up with the phrase, behold, I am sending my messenger to prepare the way before me. That's from the book of Malachi. And in fact, the Gospel of Mark begins with a portrait of John the Baptist. And John the Baptist is patterned after Elijah, right? He wears Elijah's clothes. That's why we're told what John the Baptist pictured on the right here, how he relates to Elijah, because Elijah is described wearing a similar costume. So there's a strong affinity between John the Baptist as Elijah brought back to life. Indeed, in the rest of the narrative of Mark's Gospel, the characters in the story aren't quite sure who John the Baptist is. Is he Elijah come back to life? Well, of course, in Mark's opinion, in many ways, John the Baptist is Elijah redivivus, Elijah brought back to life. Although from Herod's point of view, in Mark chapter 6, Herod thinks that John the Baptist, Herod thinks that Jesus must be John the Baptist brought back to life, because Herod had killed the prophet John. So just as Elijah haunted the history of Israel, so John the Baptist was haunting the consciousness of the murderous Herod. So this notion of the AWOL prophet, the prophet who's lurking, haunting us, is very, very powerful. Again, in Mark's Gospel, in chapter 8, in the famous moment where Jesus turns to his disciples and says, "Who do you say that I am?" They say, well, some say you're John the Baptist, but others say you are Elijah. So in some way, the narrative of Jesus and John the Baptist and the prophet Elijah are so tightly woven that they're almost inseparable. This, of course, culminates in the Transfiguration story in the Gospels, where Jesus is up on the mountain and he is talking with Moses and with Elijah, the archetypal giver of Torah and the archetypal prophet. So it's worth, for all these reasons, it's worth investigating a little bit the life of Elijah. Elijah appears suddenly in the book of 1 Kings, just like John the Baptist appears suddenly at the beginning of the Gospel of Mark. There's no prolegomena, no professional resume, no genealogy. He just shows up from the margins. Now, he's called a Tishbite, and we don't really know where Tishbe was. A lot of people locate it or identify it with Listib, and there is a 6th century Byzantine church on that site in memory of Elijah. The name in Arabic is El Ishtib, so you can see some of the resonance there with Tishbe. But the truth is, we're not really sure where Tishbe was. All we know from the text is that it was part of Gilead, and you see that Gilead from this map circled there is east of the Jordan. Now, it's kind of interesting that Tishbe can mean settler in Hebrew. And this has led some people to suggest that maybe Elijah wasn't even an Israelite. But it's more likely that this name simply reflects the fact that when Israel came across the Jordan into Canaan, not everybody crossed the Jordan. Some people stayed on the eastern side of the Jordan and settled up in Gilead, a very mountainous terrain in what is now Jordan. And it may be that Elijah simply hailed from some of the tribal people living up in those highlands as a settler in that land. In any case, the geography is important, and we'll come back to it. So the first thing that we see in the Elijah narrative, the first core sample, is that Elijah invokes the forces of nature by invoking drought. And I encourage you to have your Bible with you because we're going to cover a lot of ground. This is Elijah 17:1. We're told that Elijah appears on the scene, and he says to Ahab, "As the Lord the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word." Now, a prophet who commands the powers of nature against a king, because this is very much an oppositional moment. Well, that, of course, invokes the deep story of Torah, in which the prophet Moses did battle with Pharaoh, invoking the powers of nature, the great plagues that battered the Egyptian empire, to even the contest between the marginalized Hebrews and the uber-powerful Egyptian empire. The prophet invokes nature herself. So it's nature plus the people of God versus empire. That's the archetype as it's set in the Exodus story, and that's again what we see in the Elijah story. Now we have to ask the question, who was Ahab? And why was Ahab such an a-hole? Now, a few groans from next door on that one. Ahab is introduced. Ahab has a big part of 1 Kings, is the narrative of Ahab's kingdom. This is, of course, the northern kingdom. He was a son of Omri. Now, Omri was the one who fortified the hill country of Samaria and who made an alliance with the Phoenicians. Now, the Phoenicians and the Philistines were the historic enemies of Israel, but the Omride dynasty made a political alliance with the Phoenicians. And what that meant is that Israelite agriculture was sold, was extracted by the royal dynasty of the Omrides, and traded with the Phoenicians for economic security and other sorts of access to port and trade routes that the Phoenicians controlled because they controlled the coast. Ahab is the fourth successive dynasty in the northern kingdom. But the book of Kings is very clear in its assessment of this dynasty. The narration says in refrain, "And so became king of Israel and did evil in the sight of the Lord." at.You'll made a big deal out of this to say that this is the only example in ancient literature we have of a court history that is unequivocally critical of the kings. And so this is already a prophetic history of those dynasties. Now, during Ahab's reign, things got even worse. Among other things, Ahab rebuilt the city of Jericho. And Jericho, of course, is the famous Canaanite city-state that came down through an Israelite circle dance and the playing of a little jazz back in the story of Joshua. And you might remember that when the walls come tumbling down, Joshua says, warns Israel, "He who rebuilds these walls will do so at the cost of their firstborn son." It was a strong warning never to rebuild that walled city. Well, Ahab rebuilds Jericho, and that's one of the reasons that Ahab is going to meet his demise in the story. So Ahab was, historically, we know he was a strong king. There's actually evidence from the Assyrian archaeology that talks about alliances with Ahab. He was a very militarily strong king. He's a politically strong king. Built lots of palaces, bleeding the peasants dry with taxes, and built alliance with the Sidonites, or the Phoenicians. So understand that in the history of the Hebrew Scriptures, strong kings, the ones that actually show up in the imperial archaeology of the time, are relentlessly denounced in the literature of Israel. And of course, Ahab is famous for marrying Jezebel. Now that's important not because of all the misogynist portraits of Jezebel as the evil woman, but because this was a political alliance with the Phoenicians. Jezebel was a Sidonite princess, and this cemented the political regimes of Ahab and the Phoenicians. And Jezebel was a promoter of the cult of Baal. Now, of course, we read a lot about Baal in the Hebrew Bible. And there's a lot that could be said about the Baal cult. But I think to try to simplify it for tonight's purposes, it's important that we recognize that Baal is a Semitic word for owner or lord. Baal was the god who was the landlord of the peasantry. And the idea in Phoenician society was you force the peasantry to make tithes to Baal that then is extracted and flows up the ladder to the Phoenician princes. Essentially, Baal is acting as the on-the-ground landlord of the peasantry, extracting wealth. And that's why the Israelites, as a coming out of a tradition of free peasantry, beholden to no overlord, resented the cult of Baal, because this was another way of a foreign power imposing landlord rent and taxes on the people. Jezebel was the one who was ambitiously promoting the Baal cult all throughout the northern kingdom of Israel, and that's why she gets such a bad rap. Baal was the god of the clouds, hence the god of rain, hence a fertility god, because in dry land farming you need rain for anything to grow. And so the idea is you take your tithes and offerings and you try to bribe the fertility god to send rain, as opposed to the Yahwist religion, which saw the rain as a free gift, the soil and the fruits of the soil as a free gift, and that, and the sacrificial cult in Israel is giving back that gift to the giver. So it's not a sort of indebted relationship or a relationship of serf to the god, but rather a relationship of the free farmer to the God of grace. So that's the essential struggle between the Baalism of Phoenicia and the Yahwism of the prophet. And that is why the prophet Elijah does battle. So his first act to oppose the dynasty of Ahab and Jezebel is to invoke drought, just like Moses and Pharaoh. This again is a battle over who really brings rain. Is it the fertility god Baal, or is it Yahweh, the creator of the universe? And remember that rain is the key to dryland farming. So this is this is really a key blow to agricultural Israel. Now, Elijah is dispatched to the Wadi Cherith. Wadi is Arabic for stream bed. It's what we in California would call an arroyo, a seasonal stream. And it would have been, in a time of drought, the last place where water would have been. And we know about that in our drought here in California. You have to go way, way, way up the arroyo to find any water at all. And the word of the Lord comes to Elijah, go and hide yourself by the Wadi Cherith, and there drink from the brook. And that's what Elijah does. Now, this is kind of an interesting little geographical note, because it turns out that the Wadi Cherith is identified with the mountainous region east of the Jordan, if you remember your map, in the land of Gilead. And the Gospel of John actually invokes the name of Salim, which many people think Cherith and Tishbe are close to. So we read in John 3 that Jesus and disciples went to the land of Judea, remained with them and baptized. John was also baptizing, but in John's Gospel, John the Baptist is not baptizing at the Jordan. He's baptizing in the Enon, which was a tributary to the Jordan watershed. And then we're told later in John chapter 10 that Jesus went away again across the Jordan, east of the Jordan, to where John had first baptized, and there he remained. This is at a critical point in the Gospel of John. In other words, Jesus at a critical point in his ministry hides out at the very same place that John the Baptist hid out. And there's been a number of interesting archaeological studies to suggest that the place John the Baptist hid out and Jesus hid out was in fact the place that Elijah probably hid out. Very, very evocative stuff. In fact, one scholar goes so far to say that the early Christians during the Roman siege of Jerusalem also went to the same place in the mountains to hide out. There is the suggestion here that the wilderness, the home of the wilderness prophets, is way, way, way up in the mountains where the arroyos still have a little bit of water. That's where we can survive drought, and that's where we can hide out from empire. Well, famously, that wadi finally dries up, and so Elijah is sort of hoisted on his own petard, so to speak. He invokes drought, but now he is suffering from drought. And here's the famous story of the raven feeding the prophet. Now, this is a long tradition in Scripture. We see in Job 38 that God feeds the ravens. We see this again in Psalm 147. God feeds the animals their food, the young ravens when they cry. So the idea here is that Creator feeds the bird feeds the prophet, and that's how we get by in hard times. We might further cite Jesus' famous citation of the ravens in Luke 12. Pay attention to the ravens. They neither sow nor reap, but they have neither storehouses nor barns, and yet God feeds them. That's drawing on this tradition of the birds who feed the prophets. Now, part of the raven's success as a species is due to their omnivorous diet. They're extremely versatile and opportunistic. They find sources of nutrition feeding on everything from carrion to insects to cereal grains, berries, fruit, small animals, food waste. Ravens may also consume the undigested portions of animal feces. So you can imagine the raven handing Elijah a little bit of animal feces, saying, "No, taste it, it's good." They store surplus food items. It's very interesting to look at ecologically at ravens, or the species called corvid, because they're very, very resourceful critters. And it is so here we have the amazing notion of the prophet depending on a wild animal for sustenance, depending on a bird. Also interesting that the raven will sometimes steal the food of others just to feed those the raven wants to feed. That's how Elijah survives. But when the wadi finally dries up, then we're told the word goes to him, and he saying, "Arise, go to Zarephath, to a widow there." Now, what's interesting about this story is that Elijah is being summoned from the wilderness east of the Jordan to go all the way across Palestine to Sidon, which is on the coast and is the land of the Phoenicians. And there he is going to encounter a widow who is dying. So this is a sort of a symbolic journey in which the prophet is going to now confront the imperial adversary, and yet do so through solidarity with a victim of that empire, namely a widow of Zarephath. And as you may remember this story, he comes to the widow, and the widow says, "Well, I'm just about to die, so go ahead and have the last morsel because I'm just about done." And of course, Elijah famously is able to heal the food storage, and they're able to eat. But make no mistake, this is a story of resistance to empire. And it all happens because the prophet has invoked drought, the forces of nature. The second core sample I want to acknowledge here is the way in which Elijah does battle with the prophets of Baal in 1 Kings 18. So the drought story and the widow story is 1 Kings 17. The next chapter is all about directly confronting Ahab. And notice in this confrontation, look at the text, when Ahab saw Elijah, Ahab said to him, "Is it you, you troubler of Israel?" Elijah answers, "I have not troubled Israel. You and your father's house have forsaken the commandments of God and followed Baal." This is sort of a classic moment, isn't it? Who really troubles society? Is it the prophet, or is it the king's bad policies? This is what's going on with 1 Kings chapter 18, and so seems like a good time to invoke again William Barber, this incredible prophet in North Carolina who is troubling the legislature of North Carolina. And yet, who's really ruining North Carolina? Who is troubling North Carolina? Is it bad legislation, or is it good prophecy? That's the kind of issue that we have here in the Elijah story. Now, when you read, as I hope you will if you're inspired by this, when you go and read 1 Kings 18, you see that the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal is hilarious. It's full of satire, in which Elijah taunts the prophets of Baal, and they're limping around invoking their god. This is a direct war of myths between the Baalistic fertility god and the Yahwist prophet. But what is key, and what I don't want us to miss, is the fact that Elijah, for this big showdown to take place, Elijah builds an altar out of 12 stones. And that is really drawing on a very deep tradition of wilderness symbolism. the symbolism of the unhewn stone of Exodus 20, of a tradition that's still alive in Celtic Christianity and other traditional religions that see just unre-engineered stones, just an altar of earth is all we need in the wilderness. Now the notion of the 12 stones here in the showdown with the prophets of Baal brings to mind how Israel entered the land of Canaan back in the book of Joshua, chapter 3 and 4, when they came across the Jordan River, and as they were crossing the dry river Jordan, because remember the Exodus story starts with the crossing of the Red Sea on dry land, and it ends with Israel coming in the back way into Canaan on dry land as the river Jordan is parted. But out of the middle of the river Jordan, the priests are instructed to take 12 stones. And when they get to the other side of the Jordan, just before commencing their symbolic assault on this city-state of Jericho, we're told that they made an altar of 12 stones. Now, obviously, these 12 stones represent the alternative body politic of Israel. It is the alternative political vision of the tribal confederacy with no king and no centralized extractive economy. So whenever you see 12 stones in the Hebrew Bible, that's the memory of wilderness Israel, of Israel that before it succumbed to centralized monarchy. Now, in the time of a bad monarchy, Elijah builds an altar of 12 stones. So that's a direct ideological assault on Ahab's centralized rule. But Elijah doesn't stop there. He makes a big deal out of pouring water onto the altar and pouring water until it's completely saturated to try to make a point, because he's about to call down fire from heaven. Now this is Elijah, the lone Yahwist prophet, versus 450 Baalist prophets. By the way, only half of the 800 Baalist prophets who were invited actually showed up. Elijah's way outnumbered, but the Baalist prophets limp and they rave and they cut themselves with stones, reminiscent of the Gerasene demoniac in Mark's Gospel. And then using these archetypal elements, elemental spirits, water, and then fire, Elijah calls down fire and lights the altar into a blaze. And he does that, verse 37, so that God will turn the hearts of the people back. And that's why Malachi envisions Elijah coming back to turn the hearts of the people. That is what the prophet does. Well, that may be all very well and good, but, and of course, on the heels of that conflagration at the altar, the story ends with rain coming, as you see here. Notice again going out to sea 7 times where the rain is coming. All of these archetypal symbols of ancient wilderness Israel. And then, of course, the drought is finally broken. That's great, but Jezebel goes ballistic and puts out an APB on Elijah. And so the third core sample is that Elijah goes to live in a cave. And that's the story of 1 Kings 19. Now, King Ahab, who's called in the Deuteronomic history the killer of the prophets of Israel, certainly is capable of killing prophets. He's being egged on by his Phoenician wife. Here now in the on Mount Horeb, in a cave, again up in in the wilderness, Elijah takes refuge. This time he's fed by an angel. He has an epiphany at the mouth of the cave in which God passes by, and he hears the still small voice. This is wilderness prophecy unplugged and stripped bare. So we've got a prophet who invokes nature, who does battle with the Baalistic Phoenician dynasty, using elemental spirits of fire and water on an altar of 12 stones. who inhabits wadis and caves deep in the wilderness, who knows how to survive on very little, who communes with the God who is domesticated by no empire. Now there's lots of other things in the Elijah story that if we had time would be fascinating. One of them being the story of Naboth and Ahab, which is a parable of the history of dispossession. That's 1 Kings 21. And we'll do another webinar on that one because that's a whole story in and of itself. But what's relevant to that story here is the fact that Elijah returns from the wilderness to confront Ahab yet again in defense of Naboth, who is the archetypal representative of the traditional people of the land, the people who have not sold out to empire. It's a fascinating story, and we will look at it in another webinar. The last core sample that I want to look at Elijah as wilderness prophet is going back to Elijah's famous exit, in which he ascends on a fiery chariot. This is an ancient icon on the right and a more contemporary icon on the left of Elijah's ascendancy. But notice how the mantle between Elijah and Elisha functions here. Because let's not forget that Elijah wasn't just a superhero prophet. Elijah actually tried to build a movement. And he did that by calling disciples and forming a school of the prophets, as it's called in the narrative. His most famous disciple was Elisha. You remember the story of how Elisha is plowing in the field, and Elijah comes and lays his mantle on Elisha and calls him from the field into the prophetic vocation. A story, by the way, which lies just under the surface of the gospel narratives of Jesus' call of the disciples. It's the prophetic rabbi who comes and literally calls you from your workplace into the vocation of trying to turn the tide. Well, that mantle connecting Elijah and Elisha, that incredible story of Elijah's assumption. Notice how in the story of Elijah's ascendancy in 2 Kings 2, we read the following. Elisha kept watching and crying out for Elijah. But he couldn't see him any longer, and he picks up the mantle of Elijah. And he takes that mantle, verse 14, and strikes the water, perhaps in frustration that his mentor has been taken from him, perhaps testing it out. And when he had struck the water was parted. Note that this took place at the River Jordan, that storied archetypal space of Elijah and John the Baptist and Jesus. Elisha takes the prophetic mantle and strikes the water, and the water parts. So not only is Elijah a nature prophet, but his disciple Elisha, with this mantle, also becomes someone who can command the powers of nature on behalf of the movement of Israelite dissidents and in resistance to bad politics and empire. In all four ways I believe that we've looked at today, there's so much more to the Elijah story, but in all four of these ways I think we see in Elijah the marks, the archetypal signs and marks of a wilderness prophet. And that is why Elijah haunts the gospel story and continues to haunt our history as we try to recover our own prophetic vocation. Now, Jim Perkinson, I want you to activate your video and your audio, if you would. We have the privilege of having Jim tune into this webinar. And Jim is someone who has done a lot himself on the deep wilderness tradition of Israel and how that correlates with messianic movements today among traditional indigenous people, and Jim is going to activate. I think your audio is activated, but not yet your video, Jim.
I
So
don't
if you
have
go ahead.
I don't have a button for the video up there. It has disappeared. I don't know what happened to that, but there is no icon for the video that was there before.
Weird. Well, we can hear you, and we're seeing a picture of you. I'm sorry we can't see you, but we got a picture up on the screen, and we can hear you really well. So let's. Why don't you go ahead, Jim? We started about 5 minutes late. We're going to go about 10 minutes long. Jim, if you just close us out with 8 or 10 minutes of your thoughts on what we've talked about and what you're doing in your newest book, Messianism Against Christology.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to actually start out what I have to say with a little spoken word piece that I scratched out when I was participating with Ched in a watershed discipleship gathering back in November, in which I said, in effect, I'm interested in the meaning of watershed on the hard streets full of black beets, steaming concrete with fleet thoughts of repeat scenarios of deer and bear living fierce without fear by the clear waters of a river of straits gate between the great huge lakes of thirst slaking, ice making, cloud baking, fate breaking liquid life that stands as 20% of the globe's guzzlement, wondering how it meets the eye of dark skin, hustling quarters at the corner, or looking out from behind the bars in a place as far away as Mars from the car company, energy trumpeting finance freaks ruling my city and the planet. And that particular little piece has gained poignancy in the last couple of weeks as I'm here in Detroit and we're facing the culmination of a series of takeovers, certainly beginning 60 years ago with white flight and corporate deindustrialization and all kinds of manipulation by banks, the subprime crisis, but most recently by an imposed emergency manager, probably backed by Koch brothers money operating through the state legislature, putting much of the city up for sale and most recently trying to privatize the Detroit Water and Sewage Department, and doing so by initiating a draconian series of shutoffs, planning to close out as many as 150,000 residences by the end of the summer through a contract to a wrecking company named Homerich, who drive their trucks out every day, and often early in the morning, and shut off water, particularly for people of color. And a number of us have begun blocking those trucks. And in the last 2 weeks, I've been arrested twice, and myself now had occasion to look out through those bars and look back at Empire from inside its own belly. And it's really all of that struggle over water, Detroit being a strategic city named by the Jesuits, Detroit, the strait passageway between Great Lakes, where resides 20% of the world's fresh surface water. Strategic city as we enter into this century of water wars, where increasingly that particular gift of the creation is going to be fought over and is already being fought over. So that's sort of the background to where I am in my thinking. The book that Ched has up on the PowerPoint right at the moment, Messianism Against Christology, was a beginning attempt on my part to think through the biblical tradition, particularly Christologically, not so much focused on Jesus as the Christ, but focusing on the movement he was part of, the movement that really began with John the Baptist, that Jesus apprenticed himself to, went down under John's hands into the waters of the Jordan, came out, begun to have his own trance experience, and compelled by a dove, deep part of the Jewish tradition, to go into the wilderness and learn how to listen to the land in a new way. Initially by listening to the history that lies on the land in the series of temptations, having to come to grips with the way his own people's history is alive in him. And so it's that particular set of concerns that I have been working with, and in that book, looking then at messianism as any social movement initiated inside empire that tries to open up memory of living more justly, socially, and more sustainably, ecologically in a conquered environment. And so reading through the biblical tradition with that kind of focus operating, and in particular using the term messianism rather than Christ, but both of them referencing anointing, and biblically the very first things that are anointed within the text are actually stones before people. Stones that are marked out as bearing memory in a particular way, which goes way, way back in indigenous cultures around the globe, Celtic, but also all across the Asian steppe, all over in Native America. Stones used as markers, as kind of material prayers that carry the history of the people and remind about the kind of symbiotic relationship human beings are actually involved in. And then also the idea that Ched was talking about hauntings, paints, ghostly energies. In the book, I work with the ideas of Avery Gordon, who writes a book called Ghostly Matters, which is a sociological treatment of what happens in societies when people are disappeared, killed off, genocidally eliminated. The memory, the energies, the place they inhabited, she theorizes, is haunted by seething presences that animate the kind of artistic work that people engage in from that point forward, which is eligible to be taken up by social movements, to animate those movements, to remember what happened, and to push towards a different kind of future. So the book is very much looking at that, and as we've already been talking about, biblically, Elijah is a kind of haunt of the Jewish tradition. John the Baptist himself haunted by Elijah. Jesus haunted by John the Baptist. A whole tradition that is rooted deeply in the kinds of wilderness efforts that Ched has been unpacking, hiding out in a wadi, relying on bird life for both nurture and message, having to be reschooled in a whole way of living that's alternative to empire. And in particular, one of the things that animates me in the book is the idea that Elijah himself was probably haunted. When Jesus in the Gospels invokes the prophetic line that he considers himself to be part of in Matthew and Luke, he does not begin with Elijah. In fact, he begins with the name Abel, who is situated in Jesus's prophetic genealogy as primordial prophet that is speaking, and speaking through Jesus among others, which is rather interesting because Abel himself in the biblical text never speaks, is a kind of mist, a figure of disappeared indigenous, in his case, pastoral nomad, killed off by farmer brother, whose blood is swallowed by the ground and cries out. And it's not clear from that point forward whether it's the ground crying, the blood crying, Abel crying, but it's there as a haunt of the soil that arguably animates and haunts the biblical text all the way through up to what happens in the book of Revelation, where Babylon is brought down because the blood of all the prophets, indeed of all the innocents of all the ages, is stored there in the commodities, in the infrastructure, in the towers, in the piled up, ripped out life and minerals of the natural world. So it's a kind of deep, wild violation that I think animates the prophetic tradition that you can trace through from that early murder all the way through Jesus' initiation at the hands of John and his wilderness sojourn to get clear on his vocation. The voice in the wilderness that is driving John, that also drives Jesus, arguably might be figured as the voice of Abel.
Well, Jim, and I want to say to everybody on the call, you've just seen 10 minutes of brilliance from Jim Perkinson. I often say Jim is just about the smartest person in our movement, and you just got a glimpse of that. Jim, thank you. I'm hoping that in the course of the rest of this year in the fall, we will do a webinar with you and Bill and others there in Detroit around the issue of water politics and justice and the issues we've talked about today. Thank you for your witness in trying to stand for justice in Detroit. We've been tracking that and are praying for you. Thank you for your contribution, particularly this book, Messianism Against Christology. I want to really encourage all of you on the webinar tonight. These books are available. Jim has really established himself as a great interpreter of both white theology and black theology. But this latest book is really a tour de force, and I want to encourage you to get to know Jim's work, both his prose as a theologian and his poetry as a hip-hop poet. So thank you, Jim, for making contribution tonight and clarifying some of these things and how they actually get on the ground.
Thanks for
I hope this. I hope this is. Thank you, Jim. This has been a little bit of a taste of Elijah and wilderness prophecy, as well as a little bit of a accompaniment on my tour over the last 5 weeks to see incredible people, including Jim Perkinson. I want to emphasize to all of us tonight how many beautiful people there are in our movement and how important it is that we connect with each other, whether that's by moving around the country or by reading books or by a webinar. So thank you for joining us. Next month is our annual free community webinar. We do it once a year in the summer, where we interview venerable elders in our movement about their work. And this year we're interviewing Jeff Dietrich, and if we're lucky, maybe also Catherine Morris. Jeff and Catherine are the founders of the Los Angeles Catholic Worker, the mothership of Catholic workers in the West. Dear friends, long-time prophets in the wilderness of inner-city Los Angeles, and that will be a good time. And please let your friends know. It's an opportunity to log on at no cost and hear a really great colleague in this work, in the Catholic worker tradition, of which we are all children in one way or another, directly or indirectly. So be sure and tune in and help us spread the word. We rely on word of mouth and on your promotion of these webinars. We do it once a month. It's always really interesting with people like Jim Perkinson and Jeff and Catherine and so many others. So thanks for tuning in. I know it's late, particularly for those of you on the East Coast, so we'll shut it down. We ran a little late. Sorry that we got started late. hey, it's summer. And we do invite you to work with us to help extend our reach and reduce our carbon footprint by doing these webinars. So thanks for your participation tonight, and we'll see you hopefully next month. Peace.